The square was packed. From every continent, voices murmured prayers, while the sky above the Vatican glowed a faint gray. The anticipation was unbearable. Then it happened. White smoke. The crowd exploded into cheers. The bells of St. Peter's rang in joy, and the world turned its eyes to the balcony. Habemus Papam! The words echoed, but the name that followed caught even seasoned Vatican journalists off guard. Robert Francis Prevost, who has chosen the name Leo XIV. It was as if time had frozen. Reporters exchanged confused glances. Some whispered, "Who is he?" Others rushed to search his biography. A pope from the United States? And that name, Leo, had not been used in more than a century. Yet those who knew church history quickly grasped the message. Pope Leo I, known as Leo the Great, had faced the terror of Attila the Hun not with soldiers or violence, but with words of truth and unwavering faith. By choosing Leo, the new pope was not seeking attention. He was recalling courage, clarity, and charity. Born in Chicago, Robert Prevost had spent years as a missionary in Peru, walking barefoot into villages forgotten by governments and maps. He had learned Spanish, served the poor, and become a spiritual father to many. Later, he was appointed bishop in Chiclayo, and under Pope Francis became prefect for the dicastery for bishops, a position of immense responsibility, yet one he exercised with profound humility. During the conclave, cardinals had searched not for a ruler, but a shepherd, someone who could heal wounds, not deepen them, someone who could listen before commanding, love before judging. And so they elected him. When he stepped onto the balcony, he did not wave like a politician. He didn't smile for the cameras. He stood still, eyes lowered. Then slowly he raised his gaze and said with a trembling voice, "Brothers and sisters, I ask you to pray for me. I want to be the servant of the least among you." Silence fell over the square, a reverent, sacred silence. And in that moment, millions around the globe felt something shift, not in the air, but in the heart. The Church had a new pope, and the world had just met Leo XIV. Robert Prevost was born on September 14, 1955, in Chicago, one of the busiest and most diverse cities in the United States. But his home was far from the luxurious centers or the calm of suburban houses. He grew up in a modest and silent neighborhood, where voices in Spanish and Polish mixed with the sirens of the city and the silence of forgotten lives. His parents were simple. His mother, a Catholic of deep faith, taught catechism in the parish and never missed Sunday Mass. His father, hard-working and quiet, never spoke loudly, but taught by example. Generosity to neighbors, respect for silence, and gratitude for the little things. It was in that environment of daily sacrifice and invisible dignity that the young Robert discovered something that would mark him for life. God often hides among the poor, the simple, and the ignored. He would spend hours in the parish helping Father Michael clean benches, arrange hymnals, light candles. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just wanted to be close to what he felt was holy. In school, he was not the best in math or science, but he had something rare, a listening heart.
He noticed when someone was sad, offered help without being asked, and refused to mock the weakest, even when others expected him to. One afternoon when he was just 10 years old, he saw a man sleeping on the church steps. Everyone avoided the beggar. Some crossed the street. Robert approached, knelt beside him, and said, "If you're hungry, I can bring you bread." He didn't wait for applause. He didn't even know what charity meant. He just felt that Jesus might be under that blanket, hidden in dirt and silence. Years later, a sister from the parish would say, "We always knew Robert would be a priest. He already had the soul of one long before the seminary." His calling didn't come through visions or miracles. It grew like a seed, nourished in silence, watered with compassion. And thus began the story of the boy who walked the streets of Chicago with clean hands and a compassionate gaze, the same gaze that would one day embrace the world from the balcony.
Robert entered the seminary with a calm and determined heart. He did not seek prestige or a microphone. He sought only to serve. The halls of the seminary welcomed him with books, prayers, and silence. And it was in the silence that the first restlessness began to stir within him. While others dreamed of becoming parish priests in cities or teachers in Catholic schools, Robert was drawn by a deeper, more disturbing voice, a whisper from God, almost imperceptible, that pointed not to comfort, but to abandonment. During his studies in theology and canon law, he discovered the order of St. Augustine, a congregation that combined intellectual life with missionary presence. He was struck by a phrase from St. Augustine: "Do you wish to rise? Begin by descending. You plan to construct a lofty edifice? Lay first the foundation of humility." Robert made his vows in the order in 1981, and from then on, he allowed himself to be led by something greater than his own plans. And it was then that the church asked something unexpected of him. "Would you be willing to go to Peru?" It was not an ordinary assignment. The region of Chiclayo was marked by poverty, droughts, social tensions, and a church struggling to maintain hope in the midst of pain. Most missionaries declined. But Robert said yes. No hesitation, no conditions. When he arrived in Peru, his American accent drew attention. His skin color and origin seemed distant from that arid and poor land. But he did not impose himself as a stranger. He sat with the people. He listened. He learned their language. And above all, he shared their suffering. There were no photos, no news coverage, just him, a worn Bible, a pair of sandals, and a heart willing to lose itself. He celebrated Mass on wooden tables. He slept in humble rooms. He walked hours through dry fields to bring communion to a family. And little by little, that foreigner became one of them. One of the faithful would later say, "He arrived as a missionary, he stayed as a brother." And in those lands of dust and tears, Robert discovered a profound truth. It is not we who evangelize the poor, it is they who convert us. In Chiclayo, Robert Prevost thought he would remain a simple missionary for life, but the church, attentive to the fruits of humility, saw in him not just a pastor of souls, but a man of vision and balance. His ability to reconcile opposites, to listen with patience and speak with gentleness, drew attention. One day, an envelope arrived from Rome. It was not a letter of praise, it was a calling. Pope John Paul II, who had been following the reports of the Peruvian bishops, had chosen Robert Francis Prevost to be the bishop of Chiclayo. At first, Robert hesitated. He felt unworthy. He had no ambition for a mitre, let alone a cathedral. He was a man of dusty roads and homemade altars. But after a long night of prayer, he understood. Obedience is also a form of love. He accepted. His ordination was simple. He requested that instead of expensive robes, they keep the ceremony close to the people. The cathedral was filled with peasants, fishermen, widows, and barefoot children, many of whom had received communion from his hands. From the first day, Bishop Robert made it clear. He would not live in a palace. He would remain in the same modest home, and his door would always be open. He walked through the neighborhoods on foot, sometimes barefoot, not as a gesture of sacrifice, but because the paths were flooded, and he did not want to ruin the sandals he would later give to someone in greater need. One morning, a group of politicians came to visit him, offering funds for diocesan projects. He thanked them. But before accepting anything, he asked, "Have you already visited the garbage dumps where our children play? Then let's go together." They left in silence. That same day, 3 new aid projects were approved. His episcopate was not marked by press or glamour, but it was full of visits to the sick, nights of prayer, funerals in rain-soaked cemeteries, and encounters with those no one visited. People whispered in the markets, "He's not just our bishop, he's one of us." And it was from that dusty episcopal chair, without gold or marble, that Leo XIV began to prepare, without knowing, for the chair of Peter.
Robert Prevost had no aspirations beyond his mission in Peru, but Rome watches closely those who serve in silence. And as his work in Chiclayo deepened, word began to spread through ecclesial corridors. There was a bishop in Latin America who did not speak much, but whose presence healed. His name came up discreetly in Vatican meetings, whispered in cardinals' consultations, and in letters that passed through nuncios' hands. But Robert knew none of this. He continued to wake up early, visit the sick, and pray vespers in simplicity. Then came a phone call. The voice was formal, Vatican Italian, brief and direct. "Bishop Prevost, the Holy Father, would like to see you in Rome." He did not ask why. He obeyed. In the Apostolic Palace, he was received not with pomp, but with a warm smile. Pope Francis looked him in the eye and said, "We need men who don't want power. We need you." He was being appointed prefect of the dicastery for bishops, the very department responsible for choosing bishops around the world. A paradox. The man who never sought promotion would now help guide the selection of shepherds for the entire church. In Rome, he brought something rare, a missionary soul within the curia. While others wore designer shoes and spoke in Latinized Italian, he walked the corridors with old folders under his arm and an ever-open agenda. He made it a point to listen to local priests before approving any bishop. He visited dioceses personally. He asked about the poor. He made decisions that surprised many and comforted the humble. And when he wasn't working, he would visit retirement homes for elderly priests or sit anonymously in churches to pray. A priest who worked with him said, "He changed the air in the Vatican. He brought the scent of the streets." Meanwhile, the name Robert Prevost became increasingly common among those speculating about the future of the church. But he just smiled and continued walking. When Pope Francis's health began to decline, murmurs began to circulate through the Vatican halls. Would he resign? Would he appoint his successor? Would there be a conclave? Robert remained silent. He did not participate in speculations. He continued his service, aware that the Church belongs to Christ, not to plans or strategies. But then, the day came. A formal announcement. The Pope had decided to step down due to health complications, in the same spirit of humility as his predecessor, Benedict XVI. The Church would gather once again for a conclave. The days that followed were ones of discernment, prayer, and uncertainty. Robert entered the Sistine Chapel wearing his simple cassock, holding a rosary that had once belonged to a Peruvian peasant. He sat among the other cardinals, many of whom he had helped select as prefect of bishops. He had no campaign, no allies, no slogans, only faith. And perhaps for that very reason, something began to stir. Votes that were expected to go to powerful figures were now silently redirected. Names fell away, and Robert's rose. On the third day of voting, the decision became irreversible. White smoke, bells, tears. Millions turned their eyes to the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, wondering who would appear. And then he stepped forward, simple, trembling, moved. Brothers and sisters, I am a servant. Let us walk together. I am your Leo XIV. There was a stunned silence, a name not expected, a heart chosen by Providence. And thus began a pontificate that would surprise the world, not for its revolutions, but for its return to the essential: charity, truth, and the poor. From the very first hours of his pontificate, Pope Leo XIV made it clear that something had changed, not in doctrine, not in faith, but in tone. He chose not to reside in the papal palace, but in the modest guest house of the Vatican where he had stayed as a cardinal. When asked why, he responded, "I want to hear the sound of doors opening and closing. I want to be close enough to greet people." His first official act was not a speech, but a visit. He went unannounced to a hospital for abandoned elderly people, where he embraced each one, knelt to listen to their stories, and cried with them. His homilies were short but powerful. He spoke of forgiveness, mercy, and responsibility. He reminded the world that orthodoxy without compassion becomes pride, and compassion without truth becomes confusion. When asked what reforms he would make, he answered with a smile, "The Church does not need a new face. It needs to show its true face, the face of Christ." He began traveling, not to great capitals, but to forgotten lands, refugee camps, islands plagued by poverty, war zones where priests still celebrated Mass under gunfire. In each place, he carried nothing but a breviary and a worn wooden cross from Peru. He avoided media interviews, but when he did speak, he silenced the world. In one address, he looked into the camera and said, "You are not alone. God sees, the Church sees, and I walk with you." Soon, people who had long left the Church began to return, not because of marketing, but because they felt seen again. A child in Uganda wrote him a letter saying, "You look like Jesus to me." He framed it in his office. Cardinals accustomed to protocol had to adapt. Meetings began with prayer,
ended with questions about the poor, and often included personal challenges. Have you visited the sick this month? If not, go before we meet again. Pope Leo XIV had not come to impress, he had come to remind the Church of her soul. Every papacy faces a trial by fire. For Pope Leo XIV, it came sooner than many expected. A scandal erupted involving bishops from different countries, accusations of cover-ups, financial corruption, and silence in the face of grave abuses. The media exploded. The faithful felt betrayed. Enemies of the Church celebrated. And the world looked to Leo XIV. He could have blamed others. He could have hidden behind institutions. But instead, he called a press conference, alone. He stepped in without advisors, papers, or filters. With tears in his eyes, he looked straight into the camera and said, "I ask forgiveness. I ask it not as a pope, but as a brother, as a priest, as a man." The world went silent. Then he announced a series of unprecedented actions, independent investigations, resignations of key figures, reparation programs for victims, and a public day of fasting and penance for the entire Curia. But more than structures, it was his posture that moved hearts. He visited victims in person, without press. He listened for hours. He hugged mothers, he cried with fathers, and he said again and again, "This must never happen again." In one private meeting, a victim told him, "I thought I hated the Church, but I realized I hated what people did to it. Thank you for being different." Internally, he also faced resistance. Some bishops feared that such transparency would weaken the Church's image. But Leo responded, "The Church does not exist to look strong. She exists to be holy." His response did not erase the wounds, but it reopened the door of trust. Even non-Catholics admired his courage. A major newspaper headline read, "He faced the storm barefoot, holding only a cross." And from that storm, Pope Leo XIV emerged not with greater power, but with greater credibility.
It was a speech expected to be diplomatic, a routine address at the United Nations. World leaders, diplomats, and press filled the great hall. The world watched, expecting moderation, balance, perhaps a word about peace or ecology. But Pope Leo XIV surprised them. He began with silence, a long silence. Then he took out a tiny pair of baby shoes, worn, brown. He placed them on the podium and said, "These shoes belong to a child who never had the right to walk." Gasps. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack governments. He didn't use the word abortion at first. But his eyes were full of tears, and his voice was steady. A civilization that denies life at its beginning has already begun to die. We do not measure progress by the power to end life, but by the courage to protect it. He told the story of a woman he met in a village in Latin America, poor, sick, alone, pressured to end her pregnancy, but she refused. The child was born with disabilities. Years later, that same child became a catechist, evangelizing others with joy and purity of heart. This child taught me more about love than any university ever could. He asked the United Nations, "Who speaks for the voiceless? Where is the place of the little ones in your agendas? And then, for the first time in history, a pope led a prayer for unborn children in the middle of a global political assembly. Some applauded, others stood in silent tension, but no one remained indifferent. Media headlines the next day were divided. Some called it brave, others called it divisive. But one journalist wrote, "He did not come to be liked. He came to speak the truth." And that was Pope Leo XIV's legacy. Not diplomacy without truth, nor truth without love, but both, united by courage. From that day on, pro-life movements around the world found a renewed voice. And even some skeptics admitted, he made us look at what we didn't want to see.
The final years of Pope Leo XIV were marked by silence, prayer, and deep contemplation. His health declined, but his spirit seemed to grow even more luminous. He no longer traveled. His public appearances became rare. But every Thursday, from a small chapel in the Vatican, he would celebrate a simple Mass. No cameras, no choirs, just a few people, a crucifix, and his trembling voice. It was during one of these Masses that he preached what would become his final homily. No one knew it at the time, but those present felt something different. He spoke of the grain of wheat that must fall and die to bear fruit. His voice cracked. His eyes looked far, as if already glimpsing heaven. If I have failed, may mercy cover me. If I have loved, may that love remain in you. After communion, he remained kneeling longer than usual. When he finally stood, he looked at the small group and whispered, "Do not be afraid of the cross. It is where God hides his greatest surprises." A few days later, he asked to receive the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. He kissed the crucifix, smiled at his confessor, and said, "I am going to see the one I spoke of all my life." He passed away during the Angelus while the bells rang. The square outside filled with people from all over the world. No one ordered them to come, they just came, in silence, in tears. On the altar of his tomb, one phrase was engraved, words he once spoke after being elected. "I am not the light. I am only the finger that points to the light." And so ended the life of Pope Leo XIV, not in grandeur, but in the simplicity of a man who had loved much. His legacy continues, in broken hearts healed, in abandoned children embraced, in a church rediscovering its face. He did not change dogmas. He did not rewrite doctrines. He simply reminded the world of who the church belongs to. And that is more than enough to change history.